I kept the pen log for Detention Block 7 for 11 years before the human arrived, and I can tell you plainly that nothing I have written in those logs is as accurate as what I am about to say here. Her name was Voss. That is all I ever knew of it. One syllable, offered flat and without ceremony on her intake form. The way humans seem to offer everything. Age, 31 standard cycles. Charge, unauthorized presence in a restricted transit lane, failure to comply, resisting processing. She arrived wearing a gray station coverall 2 sizes too large, with a split above one eyebrow that someone had sealed with a strip of med tape and not bothered to re-examine. She carried nothing. She looked at the block the way a person looks at weather, like a thing that is happening, not a thing that is being done to her. Warden Drek signed her intake form and told his deputy she would be placed in the deep cell. The deep cell is not officially a punishment. It is officially a holding space with reduced auxiliary access, while a prisoner's classification is finalized. What it is in practice is a room at the end of the block where the ventilation runs low and the only light comes from a strip above the door that flickers every 40 seconds with a sound like a small bone being broken. Drek liked to use it for prisoners he wanted softened before their classification hearing. I know this because I have worked the pen log for 11 years. I also know what Drek ordered the following morning because he told me himself, which is the kind of thing a warden does when he considers the penkeeper furniture. He had a Velhari cub. A Velhari is a feline scaled to the size of a draft animal, with a coat the color of deep water, blue-black with an iridescent sheen that shifts green at the shoulder when it moves, and eyes the color of heated copper, and a jaw that closes with the sound of a vault. The adults serve as perimeter sentinels at the outer ring facilities. The cubs are something else. A Velhari cub is approximately the size of a large domestic cat. It has already learned to disembowel. It has not yet learned to be patient about it. The one Drek had obtained was 8 weeks out of the litter. It was in a reinforced carry case, and it was making a sound that was not quite a snarl and not quite a scream and occupied an unpleasant space between the two. 2 guards brought it down the block at arm's length. I noted it in the pen log under supplementary fauna, temporary. Drek told me to log it as a behavioral assessment tool. I logged it as a behavioral assessment tool. They put the case inside the deep cell, opened it from the outside with a remote latch, closed the cell door, and I went back to my station and wrote in the log, 0600 hours. Behavioral assessment tool introduced. Subject Voss. Expected duration of assessment. Until classification hearing, 72 hours. I heard nothing for 4 hours. I want to say that clearly. 4 hours of silence from that cell. No screaming, no impact sounds, no snarling from the cub. I have put Velhari cubs in cells before, not often, and not at my suggestion, and the typical timeline is 3 minutes of silence while the cub locates the prisoner by scent, then a great deal of noise. 4 hours was not the typical timeline. At the 4-hour mark, I walked the block. Standard procedure. I stopped outside the deep cell and I looked through the observation panel. The cub was asleep on the human's legs, not curled beside her, on her, pressed flat across her thighs the way a cub presses against warmth it has decided belongs to it, with its enormous copper-colored eyes shut and its breathing so slow, and even that for a moment I thought it was sedated. Voss was sitting with her back against the wall and her head tipped slightly back, and she was awake. She was running one hand along the cub's spine in long, slow strokes, and the cub's iridescent coat shifted green to blue to green with each pass, the way it does when a Velhari is content. She looked at me through the panel. I looked at her. She said, quietly, through the door's speaker, "It was cold." I went back to my station. I wrote in the log, 0600 to 1000 hours. No assessment outcome. Subject and fauna both resting. I noted that I would continue to monitor. I continued to monitor for the next 4 months. The classification hearing was delayed twice, processing backlog the standard excuse, and Voss remained in the block, and the cub remained in the cell with her, and something happened that I have no official category for in the pen log, and therefore recorded under supplementary fauna, status update each time it occurred. The cub grew. Velhari cubs grow faster than their size, suggests, is reasonable. By the 6th week, it was no longer small. By the 10th week, it stood to Voss's hip. By the 14th week, it stood to her shoulder, and its paws were the size of my entire hand, and its weight had pressed a permanent concave impression into the cell's sleeping pad. Voss had named it something in her own language. One syllable, of course, that the translation system rendered only as low tone. I noted that low tone was eating the supplementary ration I had begun including with the cell deliveries, which I logged as supplementary fauna, nutritional provision, and did not mention to Warden Drek. The guards had stopped entering the deep cell directly. This had been a gradual development. The first guard who entered after the 4th week came back out more quickly than he had gone in, and did not explain why, but walked very carefully and did not look behind him. After that, the guards used the slot in the door for deliveries and called ahead on the intercom before opening it. They did not always consciously know why they had adopted this procedure. They had simply arrived at it, the way people arrive at not putting their hand near a thing that has given them a reason not to. I knew why. Every time a guard came to the door, low tone would stop whatever it was doing, sleeping, grooming, pressing its enormous head against Voss's knee while she read, and it would stand. Not snarl, not pace, stunt. It would orient toward the door with those heated copper eyes and be still, and the stillness was worse than any snarl because it was a predator's stillness, the kind that comes just before. Voss would put one hand on the back of Low Tone's neck. The cub would sit. I wrote in my log, somewhere around the 9th week. Personnel have adopted what I am documenting as the quiet keeper standard. All approach to deep cell to be preceded by intercom contact, slot use only, no direct cell entry without pen keeper authorization. I wrote it as though it were a procedure I had instituted. In a way, I suppose I had. I had simply let the situation teach me what the procedure should be. On the day of the classification hearing, Warden Drek came down to the block himself with a transfer order and a processing escort. 2 large guards in full containment gear. He had clearly not been following the log entries, because when he looked through the deep cell observation panel, he stopped. He said, "What is that?" I said, "That is low tone, sir. The behavioral assessment tool. I've been logging the status updates." He looked at me. He looked at the panel. Low tone had stood, as it always stood when someone came to the door, and it was now simply present on the other side of the plastic glass, blue-black and iridescent and very, very large, looking at the warden with the particular quality of attention that Velhari reserve for things they have not yet decided about. Voss was sitting on the sleeping pad with her hand resting on Low Tone's hip. She was not looking at Drek. She was reading. Drek said, "Open the cell." I said, "Sir, I would recommend." He said, "Open it." I opened it. The cub did not move forward. That is important to note. It did not lunge, did not snarl, did not display. It simply stood in the open doorway and held the space, and Warden Drek and both containment armor guards found that they had each taken a step back without having intended to, and none of them were going through that doorway, and all of them knew it. Voss stood up. She gathered the one thing she had acquired during her stay, a thin reader she had requested in week 2, and which I had logged as supplementary equipment, prisoner reading material, and she tucked it under one arm. She said something quiet to Low Tone in her own flat language. The cub turned and pressed its shoulder against her leg. They walked out together. I logged it as transfer completed. Subject Voss relocated to classification processing. Supplementary fauna accompanied subject to processing threshold per established routine. Warden requested escort back to the main lift. The last part was also accurate. I do not know what happened at the classification hearing. I know that transfer orders for Voss were subsequently marked pending, and that Low Tone was reclassified in the administrative system as registered accompaniment. Handler bonded, which is a category I had not seen used in 11 years on this block. I know that when I walk past the deep cell now, the door stands open. The sleeping pad is still concave. There is a small blue-black hair in the corner that I have not swept up. I have amended the pen log to note that the quiet keeper standard remains in effect for all subsequent cell assignments. It seems only reasonable.